600 spot on your dial. WICC, Bridgeport, Connecticut.
I'm Bud Finch, and I'll be back right after Andy Carano's news. Next, over the sound of New Haven, WELI.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bob Steele of WTIC Hartford, speaking to you from the Army's Bradley Field in central Connecticut, where 25 or 30 big four-engine bombers have arrived in the past hour or so. More are coming in all the time.
The latest news from the WTHT Hartford Times newsroom.
Downtown Hartford, we bring you Hartford Speaks, transcribed. I'm Bob Maher. Here's Una King.
Well, you bright little spring boy, you're anticipating it a little bit, aren't you?
That's number 83, everybody, at WDIC, and our Dickie Robinson Countdown Show. As we check out the top 100 records for 1967.
The Ken Griffin Show. WPOP.
From high atop Radio Mountain at 95.7, this is WBMI Hartford, Meriden. My name is Dan Blume.
Connecticut Radio Memories, a series chronicling the first 6 decades of Connecticut's radio stations, as told by the people behind the microphones and behind the scenes. Episode 9, Hometown Radio Part 2. More stories from radio stations in Connecticut's smaller cities and towns. In 1948, Bristol, Connecticut got its own hometown radio station.
We're 1440 WBIS Bristol.
WBIS in Bristol.
Former WBIS Chief Engineer Lee Steele.
They were a 500-watt daytimer, but they were the only local radio station, and we had a very good adversarial relationship with the local newspaper, the Bristol Press. And we were all friends, but we were all trying to scoop each other all the time. And it was, as I say, a good adversarial relationship that worked to everyone's benefit. But it was a tiny little station.
WBIS Bristol.
And local sports was a big part of it.
Dick Newcity recalls WBIS during the 1950s.
A lot of records. It was top 40 for the time. And they used to work in conjunction with a local record store. If they didn't get the samples, they used to get them from the local record store. DJs in the morning, afternoons, man on the street interviews at noontime. Lots of news on the hour. They had ethnic shows that they used to have, Polish and Italian. That's about the type of programming. I can remember Ed Seary was on there. He was in the afternoon. He was the afternoon man. Brian Dow was on there. I really liked Brian. He was a nice guy.
Brian Dow.
Richard Price.
You know, he was just a great guy. I was pretty young at the time, and he brought me along. I was only there for a few months, but he and my co-anchor were kind of in awe of the guy. We just appreciated what he did, and he appreciated us for starting out in the business and doing what we were doing for the station that he was at. He was a great guy.
And Brian went on, and then went on to TIC, and then came back to WBIS later on before he passed away. And let's see, Eric Hatch used to be on it. He was the owner of the company. He was an author out of Litchfield, and he used to go ahead and have a show on there. And then there was Dick Kilborn, who was the manager, but he also had a radio station. And then they had Frank Maluzzo, who was the Italian fella, probably on Sundays, I believe he was on there. And then they used to have local church broadcasts from some of the local churches. The headquarters at the time of WBIS at 183 Main Street, it was on the 3rd floor. You used to have to go up 3 flights to get to the place, but they had a beautiful, beautiful setup up there. They had a huge studio that could actually hold a concert orchestra, and they had a smaller studio they used to use for the news studio, but you could put a small orchestra in there. And then the main control room, they had a floating console. Everything was floating in there. They hung it from the rafters of the building, and the thing was suspended off the floor. This was 1955 and 1956. It was kind of a pickup guy, picking up things in the studio, putting stuff back in the record files, helping the engineer out to carry stuff around the studios, carrying copy from the people that wrote the copy in the back to put it in the book up in the front in the studio, that type of thing. After a while, I went on the air. Rosemary, I can't think of her last name. She lives in Meriden now, but she had a teen show in the afternoons, and I got in there with her, and I used to do some of that with her on the air.
Lee Steele was the engineer at BIS.
Again, Lee Steele.
Brian Dow came to Bristol, Connecticut to be news director of WBIS. and he'd been here a short while, and their engineer quit, a fellow named Justin Tarnowski, and he had quit and gone to work for Bill Savitt at WCCC. Brian called me up and said, hey, there's an opening for a chief engineer. Are you interested? So I went there, and that's how I got to Bristol, Connecticut. I was with WBIS for over 20 years. Bob Douglas, he was a news director there for quite a while, and he ended up going to work for the state as a kind of a news liaison in the state information office. I've forgotten exactly what it was, but he was a local Bristol guy. When I first started, this would have been the Monday after Thanksgiving in 1960. Brian Dow was the news director because he's the one who got me to come down there. And the morning man was a guy named J.P. Aberray, John Aberray, but I lost track of him after he left, so I don't know whatever became of J.P. Aberray. We had a copywriter who also did a DJ shift, Mary Lou Jankowski, and she's married and living in Meriden now, I think. Local sports was a big part of it.
Hey, don't forget to listen to high school football this afternoon on WBIS. Bristol Central visits Hall High, and you'll be able to catch the action here. And in high school football last night, a game you heard here on WBIS. Hill House, unfortunately, beat Bristol Eastern 12-6.
Little League ball and especially American Legion baseball, that was a big thing in Bristol.
Bill Glynn.
BIS over in Bristol. I had an audition and got the job of doing the play-by-play for the Bristol Red Sox before they moved to New Britain. So I did those games for 3 years.
Again, Lee Steele.
Bristol's always been a good baseball town, and we had a good facility there at Muzzy Field in Bristol, and was and is a good little field. But our big problem was in the summertime, even though sign-off wasn't until 8:30 in June and July, lots of times at the tail end of a doubleheader, we'd have a tie score on an important game, and end of the ninth inning, and we'd be playing the national anthem because we had to go off the air. Yeah. We'd get phone calls and hate mail and something, can't you do something about that radio station?
Meet the influentials on WBIS.
And then the station moved from Main Street in Bristol over to Farmington Avenue.
Dick Newcity.
They redeveloped Center Bristol and tore that beautiful studio down when they ripped the building down. And they had a piano in there, a beautiful grand piano they used to use when they had the orchestra up there. And they couldn't get it out. They had to go, it went with the building.
The morning man was Tom Ford. His name's really Tom Hungerford.
Tom Hungerford, air name Tom Ford.
I stopped at WBIS, and I went up and I talked to Dick Kilborn, who was general manager of the station, and he seemed, somewhat interested in me, and we talked for a few minutes, and then I left, and I drove straight home, which was maybe a 15-minute ride, and when I got home, my mother said, Mr. Kilborn called, he'd like you to start on Monday. And, I mean, it was that kind of a thing, just got started like that. First of all, we had a lot of fun. It was back in the days when you could pretty much do what you wanted, and there weren't any rules regarding the music you played. You could also say almost anything you wanted, you know what I mean. We had a lot of fun, we had a lot of good times, and it was just a really fun time to work there. And I started at BIS as the morning guy. They were a daytime station. I think they signed on at 6 o'clock in the morning. I would get in there about 5. It was kind of a loose top 40 thing. I mean, we could play pretty much anything we wanted, and we were music in the morning. It was 6 to 9. And then at 9 o'clock, we had a program by one of the salesmen came on, and he did a 9 to 9:30. And then this fellow, Jackie Roberts, who was also a salesman, came on, and he did a 9 to 10 program, and then open mic from 10 to 11. And open mic was one of these phone call-in shows, and originally we started taking things like recipes and things like that, but, after a very short time, it started to get into more serious topics, and that went on for quite a while. And we started the afternoon program, I think it was at 1 o'clock. Dick Kilborn did a little thing at 12:25. He would pick something off the wire and read it. And 1 o'clock, we had an afternoon guy, and he came in and did one to sign off. And it was that kind of a thing. It was kind of a very loose programming, We used to get all the records in from the various companies, and we'd play what we liked. It was that simple. I hired Jay Richard. Jay Richard was the afternoon guy who eventually went on to be the betting barn guy. Glenn Colligan, I hired him, and he used to come in after school.
Glenn Colligan was a teenager. We had to get him working papers to work there, and he did a rock show on Saturdays.
His mother used to drive him to work, and he'd work weekends.
1440.
I was the morning guy. I ended up being program director, and I was there for 5 years. I eventually went to Channel 30.
And he went from there over to 30 as booth announcer. And for a while there, we were sort of a farm team for Channel 30 because Brian went over to Channel 30, as did Tom Ford.
This is WBIS in Bristol. It's 67 degrees at 6 o'clock. I'm Danny Lyons for WBIS News. The FBI has started distributing wanted posters on Patricia Hearst. The 175,000 posters going to the West Coast by plane also show SLA members William and Emily Harris and says all three should be considered armed and extremely dangerous.
There was a fellow named Don Goranson. He was the news director. Oh, goodness. We had a whole string of news directors. The way that the noon segment was set up was that they did local news at noon, and then regional news, state news, and then national news. And the national news was done by the station manager, who was a fellow named Dick Kilborn. And if you've worked in radio for a while, a lot of times you'll be sitting in somewhere, elsewhere in the station, and as long as noise is coming out of the speaker, you don't worry. But when you hear nothing, that's when you say, what was that? And you go trying to find out why there's dead air. Well, what had happened was Don Gordon, it was apparently a slow news day, and the lead story was an obituary for Sophie Tucker, who was a vaudeville performer. And the way it came out was, he says, WBIS News has just learned of the passing of the last of the Red Hot Mamas, Sucky Topher. And he says, that, of course, is Sucky Topher. He says, and he just completely lost it. He couldn't go on. And he's sitting there with his head in his hands in the newsroom. Dick Kilborn pops up because he's hearing nothing coming out of his monitor, and he goes running in. He thinks Don is sick. Don, what's the matter? And of course, the mic is on, and as it turned out, the fellow who was running the control board had gone to the men's room or something like that, and so there was nobody in there to turn the mic off. And Don couldn't shut his own mic off from the studio. He had a cough button, and he could have pushed that, but that was it. So he was on a wheeled office chair, and he just wheeled him away, and he sat down and finished the newscast. It took Don a long time to recover from that, and that was probably 40 years ago, and to this day, you can practically turn him catatonic by just saying, who was that again? Who was that famous last of the Red Hot Mamas? He's now a fire commissioner in Bristol.
Where the listening is WBIS. Where the action is in Bristol 1440.
It was what I would consider a fun time in radio, back when AM radio was really a fun place to work and a good job. I mean, things have changed so much. I listen to the radio stations now, and there's so little local programming. It's everything is turned around.
Hi, this is Don Moline. I'll be back with you tomorrow morning beginning at 6 to start off your Thursday. Brian Dow has all the news every 20 minutes. We'll have Bob Harris in the WBIS Weather Center, sports from Mitch Charkowitz, and ABC's Dan Lovett, plus more of your favorite music. All that tomorrow beginning at 6 here on 1440 WBIS.
Right near the end of my tenure at WBI, well, the owner had died, Eric Hatch, and his widow ran it for a little while, and then the station got sold a couple of times, and it kept getting sold for more money than it was worth, so nobody ever really made any money on it because the debt service was so high. But they finally got a construction permit for kilowatt day 500 night, kilowatt day non-directional, and then a directional array at night on 1120, and that's when the station became a good deal more viable.
Those are your friends of distinction at WBIS. Love or Let Me Be Lonely. You got your choice. 1047, the Steve Marino Go on 1120 radio.
But by that time, people had pretty much lost interest in it. FM was big, and local radio was sort of out at that point.
In 1993, the call letters changed to WPRX.
So the man sold it to WPRX, the Puerto Rican Broadcasting Corporation. And that's when BIS went dark and PRX came on.
During World War II, there was a freeze-on for licenses being allotted from the FCC.
Fred Swanson.
After the war, why these sometime part-time, sometime 24-hour-a-day smaller stations popped up around the country. One of them, of course, was WHAY in New Britain.
Rusty Potts.
910 on the dial, WHAY.
Again, Fred Swanson.
And the H in WHAY was that of Hillis Holt. Hillis along with his brother Rogers Holt, were legendary engineers who put dozens of stations on the air up and down the East Coast, at least in the Northeast Coast. WHAY went on the air in May of 1949.
Jeff Bell.
The call letters meant WHAY, what's happening around you.
Aldo Di Dominicis came in to buy the station.
When I first got there,
Don Blair.
It was owned by a fine gentleman named Aldo Di Dominicis.
Again, Jeff Bell.
He was the owner of WHAY for years and years and years and years and years. But Aldo was a great guy. He was like our uncle. We called him Uncle Aldo. He also managed their own WNHC, I think it was at that time, Channel 8 in New Haven.
Dick Ferguson.
Aldo Di Dominicis was the man who put WNHC AM, FM, and TV on the air, originally Channel 6, later to become Channel 8.
The first television station in southern New England.
Again, Don Blair.
Who also, with his Italian partners, and he was the big bucks because he owned the Italian cruise line, the shipping line, and lived in luxury in Cheshire, Connecticut, and put Channel 8 New Haven on the air for about, something around $150,000. And when they sold it to Triangle Publications some years later, while I was still with WHAY, it was multi-million-dollar profits. And then when Triangle sold it to somebody else not too many years ago, it was for like $1 billion.
WHAY General Manager Charlie Bell's son, Jeff Bell.
I remember going to work with my father to 22 Rove Hill, WHAY. My dad, Charlie Bell, was the general manager from 1952 to like 69, management and sales. They referred to it as Music Mansion or Melody Mansion because it was an old Victorian house that was from, I think, the late 1800s to the early 1900s was when it was built, I believe. I think it was like 1906 or something. And it was just, the whole house was the station. You know, the reception area and the control room were on the main floor, along with the sales staff and the sales and secretarial staff. And, the news production section was in the back where the pantry might have been. And the record library, my favorite room in the place, was right in the middle. And it was like going through somebody's house. Instead of a bedroom or a den, it was a production room. But we used to get records all the time. And my dad, every so often on the weekends, would take me into the record library, which is a room about this size, and say everything from here down, free game. So I'd walk out with stacks of envelopes like this, full of Ricky Nelson and the Everly Brothers and Elvis and Beach Boys. Yeah. It's like, cool. So I'd walk out with stacks of records. And every so often he'd do that. He'd say, all right, go ahead. Nobody's around. Go ahead. We're going to get rid of it anyway. Take it. And my dad's office was upstairs on the second floor, across the hall from the owner's office, Aldo. And you go up these big, beautiful wooden staircase. I mean, everything was handmade. And everything echoed. And it was a great place for a little kid to just roam around and, get into trouble. You could feel the music. Yeah. You could feel the energy. It wasn't digital back then. It was live, and it was, live and tape. And that's what made it exciting. That's what, when you walked into WHAY or you walked into WDRC or any of the stations where we all kind of knew each other, you could feel the energy. You could feel the energy. You could feel like you're inches away from being live on the air, There was none of this, digital mixed down, and it's all live. You could feel it. And that's what I loved about the radio station was you could feel the energy. And I was like 4, 5, 6 years old. I loved Roy Rogers. I thought when I was a little kid, I thought it was Roy Rogers and Elvis Presley all rolled into one. And my mother would take me over to the Grove Hill Clinic next door for a checkup, and I was in my cowboy outfit, and so we'd go over next door to see my father after my checkup or booster shot or whatever. So I'd go up the stairs. Now, WHAY, for those of you who may not know, was like I said, it was in a big Victorian house, and everything echoed because it was all plaster and tile and wood. So we'd go up there, and we'd go up the stairs, and I'd go bouncing up the stairs, and Aldo's office door was open. So I go in, I'm going to go see him and say hello, right? I'm Uncle Aldo. And my cap guns are going and everything, right? And I'm shooting and he goes, Jeffrey, how you doing? He goes, what? I'm going to shoot. He goes, why do you want to shoot at me? I said, give my father more money or I'll shoot you. He goes, well, let me tell you, you heard Jeffrey from the next office across the hall. It was like the voice of God. Yeah. But my father was none too pleased. Well, he got his raise, so hey. But I'll always remember that because why do you want to shoot at me?
1952. My first
job was at WHAY in New Britain, Connecticut.
Jack Borden.
At that time, the independent stations, and by that I mean the non-network stations, the unaffiliated stations, were few and far between. Now, of course, there are zillions of them. But at that time in the Hartford area, there was WKNB in New Britain, there was WHAY in New Britain, and there was a station down in Middletown, another one in Willimantic. There weren't very many. And WHAY in New Britain, they got my first job. They carried the Red Sox. Being in New Britain, they also carried a polka program. And this is what things were like on my first job. In the morning from 5 a.m. to 7, I was Pecos Jack on a show called Rural Roundup.
I got the freight train blues. Lordy, 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 got 'em in the bottom of my rambling shoe.
This was essentially hillbilly music, which I enjoyed anyway. And these were all of the artists like Roy Acuff, the Carter Family, Eddie Arnold, and all that, whose music I had admired, and now I was spinning their records. It was fabulous. And then I was using two voices. I was Pecos Jack, and I was also Tenderfoot, kind of a light voice guy. Yeah, this is Tenderfoot. How you doing today, Pecos? Well, not too bad, Tenderfoot. You know, that kind of thing. It was all fun, and people driving to work in the morning. There's a great audience for that kind of stuff in the area. It was a 5,000-watt station, and used to get a lot of telephone calls and letters, requests, and so forth. Okay, so after I did that show, I was taping Symphony Hall. This was a program that went on every evening from, I think it was 8:30 to 10 o'clock, or 8 to 10. I don't remember what time, but it was in the evening sometimes. And I used the name of Joseph Borden. That's my middle name, Joseph. This is Joseph Borden, your host for Symphony Hall. Tonight, an all Brahms program with the internationally famous pianist Janet Schriefer performing the Brahms First Piano Concerto, blah, blah, blah. So we had that in the can, and then I would go home and come back at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon. I'd drive back from Hartford, where I lived, and I do a show called Polka Hop. I was your host for that show. My name was Stosh Borden. Hey! And so every day you talk about schizophrenia, right? I was three people every day. early in the morning, I was Pecos Jack and of course Tenderfoot. And then live in the afternoon, I was Stosh Borden, your host for Polka Hop. And then in the evening, on tape, that's what I taped after I got off the air as Pecos Jack, came Symphony Hall. So there it was. A lot of airtime, a lot of fun, worked with some great people at WHAY. You know, nothing there. You could make plenty of mistakes and you weren't crucified for it. And on top of that, I got friendly with the polka band guys like Ray Henry and Wojnarowski, Gene Vishnevsky. I played on their softball team. I do remotes for these guys out at Crystal Lake in Rockville. And then I did a remote on Saturday night from the Terry Square Diner up there on the city line up near the Full of Brush plant, you know, the old Full of Brush plant on Main Street near Windsor and stuff. It was a great life. Every Thursday, I think it was, I would go to my mailbox, and there I would find a check for $52.50, my weekly pay, and I swear I would be surprised every time I opened that pay envelope. I couldn't believe that I was getting paid for having so much fun. It was great.
Again, Fred Swanson.
There was a fellow by the name of Cart Clements.
Bill Davies.
Well, his name was Carter Clements, but he went by Cart Clements. The Cart Clements show on WHAY, late 40s, early 50s. He called his program Moonlight Matinee, ran 9 p.m. until midnight weeknights, and Starburst by Krupa was his theme.
Cart Clements, who knew Hugh Greer, who was the basketball coach, at UConn, and HAY would do the UConn basketball games.
Oh.
Cart left the station, and George Ehrlich came in from Laconia, New Hampshire, where he had been working, and he was not only doing UConn basketball, but UConn football, and he more or less became the voice of UConn sports. Later, George would join WTIC to do the same for them.
Again, Don Blair.
There were some marvelous talents on the air with us. A gentleman that still, I believe, lives in Southington, and the gentleman's name, he's still a good friend, Fred Swanson.
Again, Fred Swanson.
One of the fellas who did football for us at WHUS had a part-time job at WHAY. He said, I'm going to be doing a full-time show for a while, and they're going to need a weekend man here at WHAY. So I went over, took an audition, and in August of 1953, I went on the air at WHAY.
I thought was maybe the best craftsman as far as why he played certain songs, the way he put a show together for the evening, which was called Frederick, Your Night Watchman.
I started with that in 1954 and continued that through the early 1959. It was a program that was very popular. Actually, it was known as Moonlight Matinee with Cart Clements, and then a fellow by the name of Dick Fegg took over. When I came to HAY, they decided that they put Dick on earlier in the day, and I would take over that program at night. At that time, it ran from 9 until 1, Monday through Friday. It was later shortened to 9 through 12. It was popular music. The big thing on that series was Friday night we featured the Billboard on a roll of hits with popular music, of course. But when everything got so diluted with the rock formats, why we dropped that. Some of the people that we had at HAY, young man came in from Orange, New Jersey, having done a course or two at the Columbia School of Broadcasting in New York. His name, Don Blair.
1955, and I got a letter from WHAY in New Britain, Connecticut.
Don Blair.
George Ehrlich, the late George Ehrlich, who later went on to become sports director at WTIC, offering me a job. He was then program director at WHAY for the enormous amount of money, $65 a week. How could I turn it down?
Well, I guess it went a lot farther back then.
It did. It did. We lived comfortably, I'm telling you. And I spent several formative years there doing, pop disc jockey show in the afternoon, rip and read news like we all did in those days, rip off a 5-minute, UPI summary, and you read it.
Again, Fred Swanson.
Bob Norman worked for WHAY. He would later do news anchoring at Channel 8 and later become mayor of East Haven.
But it was a very strange mixture.
Again, Don Blair.
But WHAY, because of Aldo, we would have a morning jock, your typical morning radio man. In this case, it was a wonderful old talent named Ben Hawthorne.
Ben Hawthorne. In the mid-50s, he became the morning man at WHAY.
Who had a little device in his hand that when he turned it upside down, sounded like a cow mooing. And that was his co-broadcasting friend, Bessie. And one of his main sponsors was one of the big dairies in the Hartford County area. And every time it was time for a time check or weather or so forth, Bessie would, moo, and so forth. Then they had a show by a former quartet singer that used to record with Crosby, Bing Crosby, back in the 30s and early 40s. And this gentleman's name was Womp Carlson.
This guy named Womp Carlson.
Jack Borden.
Womp had a voice. He sounded exactly like Arthur Godfrey. People couldn't believe that it was not Arthur Godfrey that they heard.
Jesting with Womp Carlson, who was Uncle Julius in Bing Crosby's hit recording of McNamara's band for an hour.
Oh, my name is Uncle Julius, and from Sweden I did come to play with McNamara's band and beat the big bass drum. And when I march along the street, the ladies think I'm grand. They shout, there's Uncle Julius playing with an Irish band. Oh, I wear a bunch of shamrocks and a uniform of green, and I'm the funniest looking Swede that you have ever seen. There are some Bryans and Ryans and Sheehan and means they come from Ireland, but by Yemeni I am the only Swede in McNamara's band.
And he did a quaint little mix of every type of music, but mostly very, very traditional music, following Ben Hawthorne. And then we would switch from about 9:30 to noon to all Italian broadcasting.
Pasqualino.
Well, when Aldo Di Domenicis came in to buy the station,
he owned a number of radio stations. I guess they used to call it the Spaghetti Network. Is that something of that nature? I think because he had a lot of Italian programming on his stations.
He had been running Italian programming in New Haven, and he thought this would be a good thing to do to hook up to rebroadcast on WHAY. We would switch to the New Haven studio for Italian programming, and initially that went until 1 in the afternoon, but that was later cut back, I believe, to 11 or 12, and one of the big features of that program was Il Drammatico La Famiglia, the radio drama. Right. They would get that from, I think, WOV in New York, which was the Italian outlet in New York City. So it was a syndicated program, right. But there were local announcers like Dino Borelli, who would later go on to television, by the way, Pasquale Carola, Jimmy Capazucchi.
Can you imagine after all these years I can remember these names?
That's incredible. Yeah.
Jimmy Capazucchi was one Italian disc jockey. Of course, we never understood a word he said, but they spoke good English, and when they weren't on microphone,
right.
They were fun guys. They were sitting in our same studio, and they were sponsored by all the famous, virgin olive oil companies from Italy and all the pasta makers and so forth, and various wines, Chianti and so forth.
One of Aldo's nephews came onto the station and was pretty much coordinating that programming, Enzo Di Domenicis. Enzo would later, of course, take over the station.
And 2.5 hours of those guys, and then they'd clear out, and then we'd go back into English programming in the afternoon. And I had a 4-hour afternoon DJ show called The Music Merchant. And I could play just about anything I chose, but of course we were playing, Nelson Riddle, Sinatra, Doris Day, Bob Goulet, you name it, and, it was pretty much my choice. Castellanets and all the good stuff.
They played, Frank Sinatra and Count Basie and Julie London.
And then in 1956, that's when I started at WHAY, some kid named Elvis Presley came along.
Well, since my baby left me, well, I found a new place to dwell. Well, it's down at the end of Lonely Street, that Heartbreak Hotel where I'll be just so lonely, baby. Well, I'm so lonely, I'll be just so lonely, I could die.
And we'd have kids almost beating on our doors saying, why aren't you playing him? Why aren't you playing him? So there's something about Heartbreak Hotel right after Doris Day singing Que Sera, Sera. It doesn't quite mesh.
But they didn't play Paul Revere and the Raiders and Elvis.
But we had to. It was driving radio stations nuts all across the country. How do you accommodate this phenomenon? You can't ignore him.
Well, they did Elvis. Actually, they did. They did rock and roll in the 50s for a couple hours a week, I guess, or a couple hours a day, or on the weekend.
Heck, when I was at WHAY, you know who came through on record promotion? Was the Big Bopper and Richie Valens. And I remember Richie Valens had a acne face, which made him very self-conscious. I mean, he was a fine, performer. But in person, he was so darn shy, you had to pull his arm to get him to tell you his name. He was a very shy kid, but he was coming out of it. And, of course, when he sang, he was a different person because he had confidence in himself, But La Bamba and stuff like that. And a couple of months later, I heard the ding, ding, ding on the news machine out in the back room. And I went out, and the machine was triple spacing, which meant bulletin. And bells were ringing, and it said, Clear Lake, Iowa. 3 rock and roll superstars died today when their small plane crashed in a cornfield in the midst of a blinding snowstorm.
Jeff Bell.
Gene Orland was another one. He did a polka show. His last name was Ostrowski, but they went by Orland. Gene Orland did a number of on-location polka shows. He'd do them from along the shoreline or different locations around the state. They were very well received. And they did jazz. My stepfather, Hermie Dressel, was a drummer from New Britain. He was the program director and music director. And he was also a local music store owner. He had Hermie's Music Store, which is now Warren's in New Britain on West Main Street. And he was a musician, and he had a trio. And he played drums for a lot of people. Jackie Gleason, Woody Herman for a while, who he also later went on to manage.
Hey, this is Hermie Dressel inviting you to come on in and join me in a new show called Hermie's Hideaway. How can you find it? Oh, it's pretty easy. I tell you, I've got my old blue lantern lit on the outside so you can see that for some way, I'm sure. And from the inside, you will hear some of the finest sounds by the world's greatest artists. Yeah, you're at the right place on your dial. 910 is the groovy spot.
He did jazz. He did a thing called Hermes Hideaway. I think it might have been 11 to 12 or maybe 11 to 1 or something, or 10 to midnight.
Say, in case you're interested and you just happen to tune in and you're wondering where you're at, well, I'll tell you where you're at. You're straight ahead because you're in Hermes Hideaway. Yeah, it's a groovy spot on your dial, 910 WHAY. Why not? Stay around with us and have yourself a ball.
And he also did a daytime show, I believe, at one point. I remember Bob Regan, the late Bob Regan, quite a very talented guy. He later went over to WEXT. He was also in news, I believe, at one time. Ed Harrigan, who was also in news.
Bill Davies.
At midnight, there was a overnight guy by the name of Alan Brown, whose, I think, principal claim to fame is that he sounded a lot like Arthur Godfrey. And if you just heard him for a moment or two, you would think it might be the man himself. But I don't know how long he lasted or where he went from WHAY.
There was a female jazz on-air personality by the name of Patty LaVar. She went on to marry a Connecticut politician, Murray Rome. She did a show that played, late at night. Bob Serkin, who was in engineering and production, went on to work for ABC News down in Georgia, Atlanta. He was a network correspondent there for a number of years. And I think also CBS, if I'm not mistaken, but I know ABC.
Again, Fred Swanson.
But that was HAY through the early 60s, and a matter of fact, the formatting at HAY also changed.
Rusty Potts.
Del Raycee was the program director there for a while, too.
And Aldo asked me to come over and program WHAY.
Del Raycee.
Aldo and I discussed it was more of a hodgepodge. We had Italian programming, ethnic or foreign language in the morning. We had some Polish on there, and so it was just mixed. And so we agreed, after a little persuasion, that I would try what was then, I guess, could have been what is now known as an adult standard radio station.
Became known as the Big Show. We were playing a little bit more contemporary music.
I tried kind of like that WNEW sound, and we were doing pretty good with it, but not well enough.
Again, Fred Swanson.
We got a new general manager by the name of John Ellinger.
WHAY didn't have a great format.
John Ellinger.
It was a conglomerate, really, of various programs, but it wasn't doing the things it had to do, and we were certainly not competing with Hartford. They offered me the managership of WHAY, and I did go up there, and I worked for Aldo de Dominicis, who was an early pioneer in a way, and developed HAY, and he was losing quite a bit of money when I went in there.
When he came into the station, there were a number of things he wanted to do. Certainly, to improve the revenue, to get a sales rep in New York. We had also a sales rep in Boston who would bring in some revenue for us. However, what they told us, especially in New York, was, well, you've got to do something more than you're doing right now if you expect us to sell the station. We are going to suggest that we have a consultant come in. Now, this was in 1964, and a fellow by the name of Bob Stevens came in. He was the program director at WRYT in Pittsburgh, which was a beautiful music station. Bob Stevens had worked for Gordon McClendon, a legendary name in broadcasting. But the consultant, Bob Stevens, said to Aldo and to John Ellinger, well, there are two things. Either you can continue as a local station, New Britain, or you can expand that into a regional station and thereby pick up some revenue. Well, obviously, they went for that one.
Again, John Ellinger.
And that was a very interesting stay. I was in New Britain approximately 6 months, and I felt in order to compete with the Hartford stations, we had to move out of New Britain. And I presented this to Mr. de Dominicis, and he wasn't hot for the program, but he decided he might go in that direction.
In And the thing was to duplicate what was being done at WRYT in Pittsburgh. Beautiful music station. At that point, I was the program director at WHAY, and I went down to Pittsburgh in early 1965 and was on the air for a week in various shifts, learning the programming from the inside out, also going into production, learning how they put together production pieces.
Again, Jeff Bell.
They also changed the call letters. I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, Radio Corporation of Hartford or...
Again, John Ellinger.
We changed the call letters from WHAY to WRCH.
WRCH 910, Rich Music.
Again, Fred Swanson.
March 1st of 1965, after a great big wild promotion, WRCH came into being.
And we termed it Rich Radio, WRCH. It's a corruption of the word RICH, but it worked. And people liked it and understood it.
WRCH 910, Rich Music.
RCH standing for Rich, and it was Rich Music. Okay, the beautiful music setup is something like this. Semi-classical music, classical recording performances of popular music. And when I say popular music, I mean people like Percy Faith and Montavani, Andre Kostelanetz, singers like Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett.
Take my hand, I'm a stranger in paradise.
Vocal groups like the Raycee Singers. Instrumental groups like Roger Williams. And it was formulaic, as they say. It was a strict format, and what we used to bridge conversation and music and program segments, in the background, harps. But that was discontinued after about a year or so.
It became beautiful music. It was sophisticated. We had some really wonderful people on the air. We had Betty Kimball. We had Phil Callan on the air. We had, of course, Ivor Hugh. I've always had Ivor Hugh about, and he's classical music, and we had some of that. And we had Alan Ford. Alan Ford was one of the hottest tickets in town. He was a marvelous guy. Lots of personality and early morning man, very similar to Phil. And it was all beautiful music concept.
It was beautiful music. It was, Montavani and 101 strings and, beautiful music, WRCH. And my father used to call it, well, anyway.
The decision about moving out of New Britain was finally forced by the new highway.
The highway was going to go through, 72 was going to go through there.
In 1966, Aldo had purchased some property out by the transmitter site on Birdseye Road in Farmington.
And we built this station in Farmington where we had our transmitter.
Put up a new building.
Radio Park, what they called it back then. Started moving in late 65, early 66. By spring of 66, they were there.
And we went into that building, and I was the first one to broadcast from the building. I remember, I think it was a Friday afternoon, I did a newscast, and things were rolling from Birdseye Road. Radio Park, they called it.
And we did compete with Hartford.
Then they went FM.
You're enjoying FM 100, WRCH FM.
Bryant Thomas.
WRCH at 100.5 did not come on the air until, I'd say, the late 60s.
WRCH FM brings you the world's most beautiful music, any hour, every day, on FM 100.
Because I remember my father being home and listening to we tried to get it in, and he would be on the phone with the engineer saying, crank it up, we can't hear it, you know.
Walt Pinto.
The AM side, 910, was WRCH AM and WRCH FM, and they basically broadcast the same music on both stations, and they were competing with themselves. And FM was just sort of taking off at about 1974 and becoming, its own medium. And somebody came in who was a pretty good salesman, I guess, and convinced the owner that he should be doing something totally different on the AM instead of competing with himself. And finally they said, okay, we'll do it. It was WRCH and WRCQ. They were just going on the air with WRCQ, 91Q. And that was the first oldie station in the area. Nobody was doing oldies. And they brought in a program director by the name of Lee Manson. Lee called me and wanted me to come over and do a shift. I did middays, and we called it 91Q, and basically we played all oldies with the exception of one new song per hour. We'd play one current song just so we wouldn't be totally out of touch. We had some good people. Jim Harrington. Jim was there. We had Lou Terry, who was a wonderful man. We had Mike Adams, who used the air name Dale Denver, doing mornings. Ted Dallacou was there for a while. We had Jonathan Dean, who uses the name Dean Richards, and he's still there.
Aldo finally retired. I don't know. I think it was sometime in the 80s, 80s, 70s or 80s maybe? I don't know. And he passed away, I think, sometime in the 90s because we all got notice. And his nephew, a very sharp guy, Enzo, took over during the different changes of RCQ.
Dick Robinson.
On Rich, when it was WRCH FM and WRCQ AM, and I bought those stations. That was like a funeral parlor. It was number one in Connecticut, the number one station in Connecticut, the FM. It was all beautiful music. It was like elevator music or dentist music. But the FM, which became still one of the number one stations in Connecticut, we'd go on there. We had the most listeners in all of southern New England to that radio station. And I would go in there at night, and nobody ever said a word. You would have to say, this is Rich, WRCH. And if you talked that way and you said anything, then no one would ever hear you or be upset. So we'd go in and say, thinking like a record would end and would say, no, that was Brandon and the West Hartford Strings, and for the motion picture Your Neckties on Fire, you're listening to Smoke It's in Your Eyes. Now we continue with the music on Rich. No one would call. No one would call because you just kept it with that same tone, and you could say anything except a four-letter word. And we would do this stuff all the time, and people wouldn't. It was crazy. Here's the most listened to station, and if you kept it with that tone, if you ever said, hey, there's Mantovani and his orchestra, people would wake up and they'd say, wow, something happened, But if you kept it, well, you could say almost anything. You could say anything. If you kept it in that tone, and you kept it, you could make up, let's say, the LaSalle Road in West Hartford. Those were the LaSalle Road Singers and the Ehrlich Music Company. You could say anything you wanted. And the Bushnell Tower is burning. And if you kept it that way, and this is the music of Rich in the air everywhere in Connecticut. And now, more. And you can say whatever you wanted to. Oh, it was incredible. And we did it. When we wanted to say it, just to, have more fun, and we would say it. And it was nuts. It was radio. It wasn't fun. It was not fun. I didn't like it. I had gone from DRC to a funeral parlor, and that was not about radio. So that's why I had to create some fun on RCQ.
This is Dickie Robinson, incidentally, and we're at WRCQ. That's the 91Q, the greatest hits of all time. Wolfman's here with me. And I want to thank a couple of people, Danny Dornfield and Lee Steele, our engineers today. They constructed and built a special studio right here for Studio R. That's what they call it. R as in Robinson. No. There's something.
Golden 91Q.
The featured group today.
Only
I hired Kenny to come over there, and that was WRCQ. Kenny was doing Fats Fontoon in the morning and all those different characters, Rocky Hill, and I just had fun with the AM. You know, Walt, you'll talk to Walt Pitto. He was there as a program director, and it was a fun place.
I know that Dick only stayed with the station a year or so. I think he decided that it didn't have the future for him that it wanted, so he sold out his interest.
After oldies, WRCQ changed to a big band format for a time. Bob Ellsworth.
Floyd Richards, Bill Hennessy, Mike Ogden, and myself used to all come in and do a 3-hour hitch. I think it was 3 hours. We'd bring in our own collection, big band, because they were on a kick like that at that time, and they were doing some of the work that was all commercially integrated in the market at that time. Al Ham's big band, 900 play, we could augment that easily. I said there was much more than that. And each one of us had a style that we preferred. I used to be a pianist in a dance band or swing band or that type of thing. Floyd was an old trombone man, and his collection favored the Dixieland and some of the two-beat and progressive stuff along the early jazz and big band sounds. Bill Hennessy, who had been host of Hennessy That's Me on WTIC every noon, he had a marvelous cross-section of collections of big band sounds, and he did his choices. And the same way Mike Ogden, younger than we were in that sense of the word, would bring us up to date in some of the transition musicians like Kenton and Buddy Rich or whatever, trying to extend the big band era.
Bill Callen.
I worked at RCQ, and they were playing sort of nostalgic music from the 40s and 30s and 50s. At first I did overnight, like midnight to 5 or 6. They put me on in the morning, and I teamed up with Charlie Bagley. He was the weatherman on Channel 3 and WTIC. And Charlie and I did a morning show for about a year and a half or so, and had a lot of fun. I don't know if the audience did, but we did.
Charlie Bagley.
Phil Callen is a great individual. He knows everything about music, which most people know. He knows everything about baseball, which more people didn't know, and he knows everything about politics. He is such a well-rounded person. Fascinating guy.
And again, they changed the format, and I was out of the job.
In 1990, its call letters changed to WNEZ, and it originally had a news format. By 2001, it had changed to WLAT.
And NEZ or whatever it was. And then WRCH, I forget when they changed it to what they are now, the adult contemporary, Light 100.
WMMW.
Frank Donovan.
MMW stood for Meriden, Middletown, Wallingford back those days, and it still does.
John Ellinger.
A friend of mine who had been at high school with me said, John, you know what, we have this new station in town. And I said, yes, I read about it, WMMW. And he said, they're looking for announcers. That's where you should be working. And I thought, gee, that might be exciting. So I met a Mr. Morley. I believe this was 1946. And we hit it off quite well, and he did hire me on the spot. So I thought that was a good omen. And I went to work for MMW, and I remained there for about 3 years. And that was the beginning of my radio career.
Fred Swanson.
And in 1949, there were only 3 Little League franchises in the state, Middletown, Naugatuck, and Southington. And I was fortunate enough to be tabbed to be the PA announcer and official scorer. And there was a local fella who worked at a Venetian blind place, and they were placing spots on a program at WMMW called the Southington Hour, and he asked me if I would be interested in doing sports during that time period, and I said yes. So that's how it started. It was a regular program, and I received nothing in the way of pay except for one item. In the fall of 1949, they said, well, if you can go out and sell time periods for a Southington football game, you can do the color and announcements on the air. And I said, fine. So So we went out and we got 4 sponsors, $25 each, $100, and we did that football game on WMMW. It was a game between Lewis High School and East Hartford, and Southington, the Lewis High School football team, went undefeated that year, 11-0. From that $100 that WMMW got for the football game, I was given a stipend of $2. I still have that check framed.
How far did $2 go back then? Is it?
Well, I could get a few copies of the Sporting News. Let's put it that way. As I say, I was doing sports for the Southington Hour, and the following year they asked me if I'd like to do the whole program, the Southington News and sports and guests, and I said yes. So that started. I didn't get any money doing that until, when I was going to Yukon at that time, December of 1952, when they asked me to do a weekend stint on Saturday and Sunday, and I said yes. And at that point, I was being paid $1 an hour.
Again, Frank Donovan.
There was a major fire in downtown Meriden, and it was a general alarm fire, and MMW Studios at that time went up in smoke, and for some time after that, then they operated out of their transmitter. You can still see the transmitters down there by the Meriden Square shopping plaza down there is MMW.
Stardust 1470 is WMMW, Meriden, New Haven. The time now is 3 o'clock.
Phil Callan.
I started at WMMW in Meriden, and that's 1,000 water, or at least it was then. I think it's a little more now. And that was in '69, and during the football season, the regular announcer had to go do the games, the high school football games. So I did the before and after, playing music for a couple hours before and after until the guy got back after the game. And what happened was they had a morning man who kept oversleeping, and that's something you don't do if you're a morning man.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and they finally fired him, and I wasn't really that good, but I was available and I could fill in right away. I could move into it right away. Needless to say, I never slept over after that, and that's how I got a full-time job. And worked there for about 7 or 8 years until new owners came in and got rid of everybody.
Sure, that's all right. Oh, boy. About a year and a half ago, Ballad of John and Yoko. A few slices made here and there. Those are the Beatles. At 3:30, you're tuned to 1470 Radio. This is WMMW Meriden, a Hall communication station.
Again, John Ellinger.
I went back, believe it or not, to WMMW in Meriden, and they were really struggling, and it had been sold several times, and it was very wobbly, and a lawyer in New York City ended up owning it, and 2 guys who had bought it, it just didn't go. They couldn't handle it, and I ran it for almost 3 years. We kept it afloat. There were like 44 businesses that had closed in Meriden, and that was very dangerous for a small station, and he eventually sold it.
Eventually, WMMW AM was bought by Buckley Broadcasting. Wayne Mulligan.
I think it was November of '97. The same situation happened with WMMW, and again, this was back through the SBA again, and you know, they came to us and said, "Look, we got another radio station. Would you like to buy this one?" So we bought MMW and put that on and simulcast that.
Broadcasting as a community service of the University of Hartford, this is WWUH West Hartford, WAPJ Torrington, WDJW Summers, and WWEB Wallingford. And now back to Connecticut Radio Memories. WMMW-FM was on 95.7.
WMMW-FM.
Ray Hard.
The fellow by the name of Schultz
owned the whole ball of wax.
The way that WMMW-FM operated, and then BMI,
Frank Donovan,
is they had a main channel and they had a sub-channel that they broke off, and they could broadcast two programs simultaneously, okay?
WMMW-FM was about to get or had just gotten a Music by Muzak franchise. It was called something other than that, Storecast or whatever.
And they had something called Storecast, and if you had gone up to the transmitter, you'd see they had these huge transcriptions. They're like big LPs, well, they're about almost 2 feet across, but they played from the inside out.
Slowly.
Very, very slowly. But that was Storecast, and later on became something they put on tape.
Used to be called, if you remember, elevator music or what have you. But that was to be broadcast on what was known as a sub-channel.
Dan Blume.
Below your main channel, which is received by special receivers that filter out the main channel, and you get the Muzak on the sub-channel.
And that sub-channel for WMMW-FM was what brought in whatever monies they had.
Bryant Thomas.
In the early days of FM, there was little money being made by any of those stations. Most of them were supported by profitable AM stations, and those that were not had to have some sort of income other than advertising, because the proliferation of FM radios was not that big at that point.
WMMW-FM's call letters were changed to WBMI in 1960.
And then one of the Schultz sons, Carl Schultz, we called him Buzz, decided that he would change WMMW-FM call letters to WBMI. And that was the initials for the business he ran, which was Business Music Incorporated.
It was located at 122 Charles Street in Meriden, in back of an old factory.
Bryant Thomas.
And it was owned by a fellow by the name of Buzz Schultz. And his mother owned the Connecticut China and Glass Shop, which was out front in the factory building itself. And that's where a lot of the money came for this radio station.
Dan Blume.
From the Silver City Crystal Company. What was the name of that?
Frank Donovan.
It was on 22 Charles Street. It was an old brick building, and down below was the Silver City Glass Company.
From high atop Radio Mountain at 95.7, this is WBMI Hartford, Meriden. My name is Dan Blume. This portion of the Jazz Show is brought to you by the Stereo Shop, 227 Asylum Street in Hartford.
Frank Donovan.
But WMMW-FM has always been up on the top of Radio Mountain, which is about 1,100 feet above sea level.
That's what is referred to here locally as, in Meriden, as West Peak.
Ray Hard.
It's the westernmost peak of what we called Radio Mountain.
Bryant Thomas, he was a real early FM pioneer at that time.
John Fleming.
And he was fearless in his devotion to his job, which took him to the top of Radio Mountain down in Meriden in the worst possible weather, where he got isolated, I think, a few times by blizzards and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it was on West Peak in Meriden, which at the time was home to a number of FM stations.
There are a slew today of antennas up there, AT&T and a few others, and WBMI's antenna was up there. It's a good FM site, FM transmitter site.
Frank Donovan.
One of the things that Arthur Lamothe told me is that BMI, when we originally broadcasting FM, we had DRC's old transmitter, the original transmitter that was used, but HCN is the one who claims the lineage to that one, because they say that Doolittle DRC sold it to them, to HCN, and that they may be right on that. But Arthur Lamothe always challenged that, and it's got I'll tell you, that's a great signal. When we were on, when Dan and I were on BMI, I had listeners up in southern Vermont. I had a couple that call themselves the Trolls, who were living under who were living under the bridge at the Groton New London Bridge, people in Long Island. We had a great signal all over southern New England and Long Island, and it still has a very fine signal.
Dan Blume.
Well, don't forget, FM stereo was in its infancy, and I got a call from Buzz Schultz, the owner, who said, we're having a lot of problems. We're getting this very spurious Morse code sound when we're in stereo, and I heard it, so you got to do something about it. So I figured Morse code. I said, we got a hold of the FBI, we got a hold of the CIA.
all the state and local entities that broadcast, finally, we figured it out. There was a exact distance between the transmitter and the studio was 7 miles, and there was a telephone line that connected both entities, and that signal, that long wave deal, ended up to be an antenna, and submarines under the North Pole were transmitting long waves, and they were rebroadcasting, and I think we installed 2 filters at a cost of about $7, and it ended the problem.
And WBMI was short for Business Music Incorporated, not to be confused with Broadcast Music Incorporated, which is the music licensee. So WBMI had a sub-channel, and it broadcast Muzak to restaurants and doctors' offices and things like that.
They were going into the grocery stores and retail establishments.
And that's where the money came from.
They hired me at that time.
Again, Ray Hard.
I had been with WMMW, and Buzz made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I became what was known then as the station manager. I used to sweep floors and do whatever was necessary. There was no physical radio station as such. It was all done on tape. And then Buzz had some engineers come in and design what was to eventually become WBMI.
Well, WBMI existed primarily because it was a Muzak franchise.
Again, Dan Blume.
And the main receiver for Muzak to be distributed throughout all the downtown Hartford buildings was in my law office. So every once in a while, I would fight off the impulse to go up there and throw the switch one time to kill all the broadcasts. But a historical note, I believe in the entire history of Muzak in this area, there was only one time when the spoken word was uttered, and that's when Ray Hard broke in to tell this area that John F. Kennedy had died.
Again, Ray Hard.
I had come home to lunch one day. We were having lunch, my wife and I guess a couple of the kids were not yet in school or what have you, and our youngest son went out on our back porch, where was kind of a recreation area we had out there at the time with a TV set in it. All he did was turn the thing on. All of a sudden I heard Walter Cronkite come on and say that there was an unofficial report from Dallas, Texas, that President Kennedy had been shot. And of course I bolted out of my seat, said to my wife, I'll see you in a little while. And as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think I called the station. A fellow by the name of Jay Richard was announcing a program down there at the time. And I called Jay and told him to set up tape equipment that was not on the air at the moment. It was just something had to be done. Went down, and by this time, Buzz and his wife Marion had assembled in the station and so forth, and I wrote up a brief announcement. It was done live and said something to the effect that we hesitate to interrupt music by Muzak, but we thought listeners would be interested in knowing that, I don't think I worded it exactly that way, but we told them that we had an unofficial report from CBS News that President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas, Texas. And that was all. We aired it. It alerted several thousands, I guess, of people throughout the southern New England area who were subscribers to Music by Muzak. Several days later, we got 2 or 3 letters from, chief executive officers or presidents or something of some rather large concerns in southern New England thanking us for alerting them to the message. When we started, it actually had no formal format, so to speak.
Ray Hard.
We developed things as they went along, and then, of course, we were able to use another of the sub-channels to constitute a stereo sound. And that's what we did. They activated, they had Music by Muzak, which was on one sub-channel, and then they took another sub-channel and put it in conjunction with our main channel, and we had stereo sound.
John Fleming.
They were able to start actually doing radio programming you could hear in the home on the main channel.
The concept of FM just blew our minds.
Dan Blume.
Here was a medium where the sound fidelity was perfect. I mean, you could have live performance, and it truly was live, and in particular, with the advent of stereophonic sound, which incidentally, we believe that WBMI, which later became WKSS, was the first radio station in southern New England with FM stereo.
Ray Hard.
Governor Dempsey, God love him, John Dempsey. Buzz Schultz and I went up and met Governor Dempsey, and he signed, I guess you could call it a proclamation, that we were the first in southern New England to have a stereo outlet. And he turned to me and he said, "Ray, is this accurate? You really are the first in southern New England?" And I said, "Well, unless you count Providence, they beat us to it a little bit, but we're the first down in this area." And he said, "It's okay," and he went ahead and signed it.
This is FM stereo in southern New England, WBMI, Hartford, Meriden.
Bryant Thomas.
It was relatively successful. It had block programming. There was, bouncy music in the morning, all middle of the road, and then there was classical music from 9 to 1, and then they had a different type of afternoon program they called Spectrum. And
John Fleming.
We did block programming back then. There was an hour of, Dixieland music and an hour of organ music and an hour of jazz and an hour of big band music and so on and so forth. And I was actually an employee there where I did that kind of thing.
It was new, and it was stereo at that point, which had just come of age, and everyone was running out to get these stereo receivers with the little red lights on them when the pilot would say you had a stereo broadcast, and that was really something to behold in the mid-'60s. And, then, of course, stereo began to proliferate, and everybody had a stereo signal after a while. But in the beginning, it was hard to find a station that would light your little stereo light. So BMI was very successful because it had very little competition, in stereo at least. TIC FM in Hartford was in and out of stereo by day part. They would simulcast the Steele show in the morning on AM, and that of course was not done in stereo. And they did some classical stuff in the afternoon and some light middle of the road stuff in the late afternoon. And you never knew when you were going to get a stereo pilot out of TIC. So BMI as a result won the early competition for FM stereo by default.
Award-winning Ray Hard is here on Thursday evenings at 8:30 for 25 minutes of Hard Facts, a show designed to let you know what's happening in the wonderful world of FM stereo. If you have questions about FM or FM stereo, send them on to Ray Hard, care of Hard Facts, WBMI, Meriden, Connecticut, and Ray would simply be delighted to answer these questions.
Again, Ray Hard.
Yeah, it was a play on my own last name. Yeah, I used to invite guests to, so long ago, Brandon, I can't remember whether or not it was a weekly thing. I think it was once a week. But anyway, we used to invite people in, and they'd talk about, if we could, we'd try to get somebody who was an expert somehow in the stereo end of the business. And we had a fellow by the name of Dr. Lou Carini from Wethersfield, who actually manufactured what was known as the FMQ antenna. And he was quite informative. He told us about line of sight and things like that. And it was things that we had not been instructed in. We had to go out and get our own answers to the questions that developed when we put the subchannel on the air and made it into stereo.
I did the Broadway stuff.
Again, Frank Donovan.
I joined the station shortly after 1960-61, and through that it was BMI already at that time.
Dan Blume.
He did a wonderful show dealing with Broadway shows and movie musicals, things of that sort. And he had a great way to selecting the most interesting and promising productions.
Ray Hard, who at that time was the station manager, was looking for somebody to do a Broadway show called, he had in mind something called Front Row Center. And I said, Broadway music, I know nothing about it, but I love broadcasting, I'll do that. And I really, my wife Phyllis and I did a program for 15 years, 3 nights a week, 15 years, called Donovan on Broadway, all the music of Broadway and Hollywood too.
You are cordially invited to join Frank Donovan on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, right here at 9 o'clock at 95.7 for Donovan on Broadway. Frank Donovan, the star of Tulip Drive. Frank features the very best music of the wonderful world of the Broadway stage and the Hollywood screen. And also, Frank manages to bring you the latest news and happenings of our own new Hartford stage company.
And we interviewed the stars. You name the great stars. They came to Oakdale or to the Schubert or down in New York, and we did those. And I still used to love late at night say, From Out of the Night to You, music from Radio Mountain.
Oh, my.
What a wonderful image. Dan did the jazz.
Good evening, friends. My name is Dan Blume, and this is Jazz.
I started out by doing a jazz show twice a week, and one of the great benefits I had by going on BMI, was the ability to cover live jazz both in the state of Connecticut and at festivals such as Newport.
By the way, there was another man doing jazz. Hal Cook was his name, doing jazz before Dan came along.
The guy who was doing the jazz show left the station, and I asked the owner if it would be appropriate if I replaced him, and I did. And I must say that the equipment at that station at the time left quite a bit to be desired. Everything was put together with Scotch tape, but eventually it got a little better. And most of my shows I actually taped at home, but this gave me an opportunity, as I say, to traverse the country and meet people. And my wife and I used to go to the Newport Jazz Festival for a number of years and come back with maybe 100 fabulous interviews. I mean, the top of the top: Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Miles Davis, Wes Montgomery, Billy Taylor. And I used to come back with these interviews, and every year the Downbeat magazine, which is the Bible of jazz, used to come out with the Downbeat Readers Poll.
Good evening, friends. My name is Dan Blume. We call the show Jazz in Stereo, and this evening we feature all the winners of this year's Downbeat Readers Poll. And getting underway, we turn to a double winner. Happens to own the #1 jazz trumpet in the United States, according to the poll, and also fronts the #1 jazz combo. His name, Miles Davis, and from his latest album on Columbia, this is something called Four.
We used to cover the poll and be able to provide interviews with about half of the winners from our library. It was a great bit of fun. It was more than broadcasting. It was very creative. It was being able to patch a show together and have continuity that made sense.
Yeah. And there was another man that did the classical, and a fellow who was an attorney up the Capitol by the name of, I think it was Walter Gribbons. He was doing classical music at WBMI.
Well, we got to mention Arthur Lamothe.
Brilliant.
When it
Absolutely
comes,
brilliant.
When
yes.
it comes to
Radio Pioneer.
On Sundays at 5 p.m., you're all invited to join Arthur Lamothe and the Sunday Folk Festival. It's a wonderful show, and I'm sure that you're all going to enjoy yourself.
Arthur was absolutely a brilliant engineer.
Lamothe.
And we're all privileged to know him.
He was the chief engineer for many, many years for WBMI, and then later on, after Fred Constant bought it, he stayed with KSS, and he was chief engineer there. But he had great depth and breadth on these items, and he was one of the remarkable radio pioneers of the time. And
but he also was a brilliant business person. He had a company that was trusted by major insurance companies when they had losses of technology. His knowledge of technology would be the only place they would go to be advised as to whether they should clean up the stuff or replace it. He was a gentleman, a fine person to meet and know, and unfortunately he's been gone for a number of years.
This is FM radio station WBMI. Now signing on for the day, we invite you to be informed and entertained with our Sound of Today.
In May 1971, WBMI's call letters were changed to WKSS. Again, Frank Donovan.
BMI wound up being sold to Freddie Constant, and Fred Constant was a young Trinity College grad, had a few bucks, and you know him better than I do. He came from the West Coast. He had been out in the West Coast, and I think at that time there was a KISS out there, and he brought back the idea of WKSS, which is still great call signs, okay? Right. Call letters. And you were involved, weren't you, in the sale of BMI to KSS?
Right, and
again, Dan Blume.
You see, this was at a time when basically the concept of the commercial aspects of FM radio, they were blossoming now. These prospects were here and now. And Freddie Constant bought WBMI, became WKSS, and he immediately put into place a beautiful music format, a format which has disappeared now. And the irony of that was that that format continued. I believe Freddie sold the station to, I think, Covenant Broadcasting was the next party. The other aspect of WKSS, it was a beautiful music station. Then WRCH became a beautiful music station, and you had two stations with virtually the exact same format. So it was a real shakeout time in FM broadcasting in this area.
Fred Swanson.
The beautiful music concept was picked up by WKSS in Hartford.
Don Mino.
I did a couple of years in Hartford overnight at WKSS. back in the 70s when we were in easy listening format with 101 strings and Percy Faith and Melocrino and things of that sort. That was 73 to 77. I started off as late night for a year and a half, and then I went to evenings. It was actually a lot of fun because our owner was a fellow named Fred Constant, who wasn't much older than I was. His parents had backed him. He bought the station at WKSS when it was licensed to Meriden. It was WBMI. They were on Charles Street in Meriden. So he bought the station because they weren't doing well and moved it. And we used to use a little moniker. We'd say so-and-so degrees at the mansion. And we really were at a mansion. Sometimes people will say they're at a place, but they really aren't, like it's an imaginary thing. On South Green of Hartford, number 2 Weathersfield Avenue, right on the corner, is a beautiful 1893 mansion built by an heiress of the Borden milk family. And we worked there. We were on the second floor. We were actually in a converted, like a sitting room, and you were overlooking the South Green. And you'd come in the front door, real thick wood doors. We had what I called a walk-in fireplace on the first floor. You could just walk right in because that would be all copper lined. We used to put a big 12-foot tree out there. And Fred had bought a station in Honolulu, and he would commute back and forth. And the third floor, there was a ballroom, and he would live up there when he was in town. And he owned a station in Honolulu, KHSS 97, FM 97. We were FM 96. So we used to do the cross promos for them. And they had KPOI, the AM Top 40, KPOI.
I think I've heard of that.
I was one of the ones that he picked to do all the promos and the liners for that because having a top 40 background. Well, that was fun. K-Boy, 1380, $1 billion weekend, this type of stuff,
So you're doing Hawaiian radio in Hartford.
Oh, it was a riot because they would ship the stuff back and forth, and it was really wild stuff. And KSS started, this would be late 71, early 72, and then it took them a while to get things organized. We had a tape service. It was that Schulke service. We had music on tape reels, and we would run like 13, 14-minute blocks of music, and then we'd do back and outside FM 96. This is KISS, WKSS. And then we'd have like a little second and a half delay between things. We'd either read a spot or something would be recorded. Station did very, very well. We would compete. Our only competition was at RCH, which had a different music service, but we used to compete with each other.
In Hartford, it's 61 degrees. I'm Pat Scalone, and this is WKSS at 96 FM.
Dick Bertel.
I was hired there to do the morning show. A fellow by the name of Tom Durney came into town. He became the general manager, and every time he would ask about the possibility of some personality joining his station, my name would surface. So he called me out of the blue one day and invited me to lunch, and I said no, I wasn't really interested. I was working at an advertising agency at this point, and he called me again, and he presented some numbers that sounded very intriguing, and so I said yes, I would do the morning show there, and I did.
So I had orange juice, and I had cereal and milk, and I had coffee.
Oh, that's a better breakfast than I had, I'll tell you.
I keep telling myself if I eat a good breakfast, then I won't be hungry. And then at 10:30, I'm starved. But I try.
Well, that's great. Governor, have a good day, and thank you very much for chatting with us here on WKSS.
You have a good day, and Tom says hello also.
Okay, say hello to Tom from me.
Call me again.
I will.
Goodbye.
Bye. All right, that's Governor Allegrasso. And if you'd like a wake-up call, just drop me a card or a letter. Send it to me, Dick Bertel, WKSS, Hartford, Connecticut, 06114. And I promise you, we will get you up.
I did the show for 6 years. The station was sold in 1981, I believe. Woody Tanger came in. Now, Woody owns WCCC, if my memory serves me correctly.
Okay.
But anyway, he came in, and he made me the general manager. And so my whole experience in broadcasting expanded considerably at that point.
That's right. Well, Dick Bertel was the program director over there for a while.
Bob Ellsworth.
And he hired me as a newsman because he knew I was on the prowl to do some freelance work. And then he and I got to do some crazy Bob and Ray type comedy in the early morning hours over there. We'd go on the street and maybe do part of it in the studio kitchen, and all crazy. I'd do dialects, and he was my straight man, It was just so much fun. Things we'd always wanted to do.
We ran the station until 1984, when, again, the station was sold, and this time new owners came in with their own manager and so forth, and I was out of work.
Marty Moran.
It was owned by, the company was called Sturgeon Broadcasting, and it was owned by, I think, the Tanger family. And ironically enough, Woody Tanger is now the owner of WCCC in Hartford. He had bought it from Cy Dresner. But it had been sold, KISS 95.7 had been sold to a limited partnership.
WKSS, Hartford, Meriden. At 95.7 on your FM dial. It's always beautiful at WKSS. And this is the way we were.
Are we off the air? Yeah. Okay. Boy, this music, I really don't like this music very much. I wish we could get to hear something different around here.
10 seconds.
10 seconds for what?
8 seconds.
What do you mean 8 seconds? What the
6
hell
seconds.
is going on around here?
4 seconds.
What are these cars? What's this car moving by?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the new KISS FM. Hartford's Hit Radio, 95.7, the new KISS FM.
More music, more music, more music, more music.
And it became a top 40 station to compete against 96 TIC FM at the time. When I got there, the morning show was hosted by Jeremy Savage. His co-host was Paul Murnane. Paul, you'll probably hear him every now and then on WCBS in New York City. He's a newscaster down there now. Nights was Tom Casey.
The new 95.7 KISS FM with Tom Cruise and Casey. Sunday afternoon, we're going to have some fun. Stand by, coming up at 95.7-minute Mega Music Marathon, please.
This program is dedicated to those who participated in interviews but who passed away before the program was finished. Bob Ellsworth, Charlie Bagley, Fred Swanson, John Ellinger, Ray Hard, Dick Newcity.
Pilot of the airwaves, here is my request. You don't have to play it, but I hope you'll do your best. I've been listening to your show on the radio, and you seem like a friend to me.
You've been listening to Connecticut Radio Memories, Episode 9. This program was produced and edited by Brandon Camp. Thanks to everyone who participated in interviews for this series, including those whose comments didn't make it to air. Interviews were edited for time, continuity, and clarity. This series would not have been possible without the air check collectors and other people and organizations who had the foresight to save air checks, jingles, or theme songs, and who shared them with us, including Ed Bruder from ManFromMars.com, Rick Kelly of Northeast Air Checks, Bob Gilmore of Bob Gilmore's Air Checks, Dan Blume, Jeff Bell, the Media Preservation Foundation, Tracy Carman, Bruce Camp, Dick Bertel, Larry Titus, Bill Davies, the Boston Radio Archives. We want to send a shout out to Bill Hennessy and the bunch of old broadcasters who meet monthly to hear the Hartford Jazz Orchestra play at the Arch Street Tavern. Special thanks also to John Ramsey. Connecticut Radio Memories was produced at the studios of WWUH FM at the University of Hartford.
Pilot of the airwaves, here is my request. You don't have to play it, but I hope you'll do your best. I've been listening to your show on the radio, and you seem like a friend to me. Oh, I've been listening to your show on the radio, and you seem like a friend to me.